An overview and some case histories, certainly a fair number of us are aware that the people running our government are not the people who are really in control of political and economic matters, domestic and foreign. This has led many to seek the truth in the alternative press, those newsletter writers who, like me, have sought, but not always found what it is that is making the United States terminally ill. Seek and ye shall find has not always been the case with this group. What we did find was that the people walk in great darkness, mostly not caring or bothering to find out where their country is headed, firm in the belief that it will always be there for them. This is the way the largest population group has been manipulated to react, and their attitude plays right into the hands of the secret government. We frequently hear about they doing this, that, or the other. They seem literally to be able to get away with murder. They increase taxes, send our sons and daughters to die in wars that do not benefit our country. They seem above our reach, out of sight, frustratingly nebulous when it comes to taking action against them. No one seems able to clearly identify who they are. It is a situation that has pertained for decades. During the course of this book, we shall identify the mysterious they, and then after that it is up to the people to remedy their situation. On 30th April 1981, I wrote a monograph disclosing the existence of the Club of Rome, identifying it as a committee of 300 subversive body. This was the first mention of both of these organizations in the United States. I warned readers not to be fooled by the feeling that the article was far-fetched, and I drew a parallel between my article and the warning issued by the Bavarian government when the secret plans of the Illuminati fell into its hands. We shall return to the Club of Rome and the role of the Committee of 300 in U.S. affairs later herein. Many of the predictions made in that 1981 article have since come to pass, such as the unknown Felipe González becoming Prime Minister of Spain and Mitterrand being returned to power in France. The downfall of Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt, the return to power of Swedish nobleman and Committee of 300 member Olof Palme, the nullifying of Reagan's presidency and the destruction of our steel, auto and housing industries in terms of the post-industrial zero-growth order handed down by the Committee of 300. The importance of Palme lies in the use made of him by the Club of Rome to deliver technology to the Soviet Union on the forbidden list of the U.S. Customs, and Palme's worldwide communications network employed to train the spotlight on the phony Iran hostage crisis, while he shuttled back and forth between Washington and Tehran in an effort to undermine the sovereign integrity of the U.S. and place the phony crisis in the realm of a Committee of 300 institution, viz. The World Court at The Hague, Holland. Them is not well hidden. In the intelligence community, it is taught that the best way to hide something is to place it in open view. As an example of the foregoing, when Germany wanted to hide its prized new Messerschmitt fighter plane in 1938, the aircraft was put on display at the Paris Air Show. While secret agents and spies were collecting information from hollow tree trunks and from behind loose bricks in a wall, the information they sought was staring them right in the face. The upper-level parallel secret government does not operate from dank basements and secret underground chambers. It places itself in full view in the White House, Congress, and in number 10 Downing Street and the Houses of Parliament. It is akin to those weird and supposedly terrifying monster films, where the monster appears with distorted features, long hair, and even longer teeth, growling and slavering all over the place. This is distraction. The real monsters wear business suits and drive to work on Capitol Hill in limousines. These men are in open view. These men are the servants of the one world government New World Order. Like the rapist who stops to offer his victim a friendly ride, he does not look like the monster he is. If he did, his intended victim would run off screaming in fright. The same applies to government at all levels. President Bush does not look like a dutiful servant of the upper-level parallel government, but make no mistake about it, he is as much a monster as are those horrors found in horror movies. Stop for a moment and consider how President Bush ordered the brutal slaying of 150,000 Iraqi troops in a convoy of military vehicles carrying white flags, on their way back to Iraq under Geneva Convention rules of agreed disengagement and withdrawal. Imagine the horror of the Iraqi troops when, in spite of waving their white flags, they were mowed down by American aircraft. In another part of the front, 12,000 Iraqi soldiers were buried alive in trenches they occupied. Is that not monstrous in the truest sense of the word? From where did President Bush get his orders to act in this monstrous fashion? He got them from the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIAA, who received its mandate from the Committee of 300, also known as the Olympians. As we shall see, even the Olympians do not hide their faces. Oftentimes they put on a show which could be likened to the Paris Air Show, even as conspiracy buffs spend their time in fruitless searching in the wrong places and in the wrong direction. Note how the Queen, Elizabeth II, performs the ceremonial opening of the British Parliament. There, in full view, is the head of the Committee of 300. Have you ever witnessed the swearing-in ceremony of a United States president? There in full view is another member of the Committee of 300. The problem is only one of perception. Who are the conspirators who serve the mighty all-powerful Committee of 300? The better informed of our citizens are aware that there is a conspiracy, and that the conspiracy goes under various names such as the Illuminati, Freemasonry, the Round Table, the Milner Group. To them, the CFR and the Trilaterals represent most of what they do not like in regard to domestic and foreign policy. Round Table has a big input into United States affairs through the British ambassador in Washington. The problem is that real hard information on the treasonous activities of members of the invisible government is very hard to come by. I quote the profound statement made by the prophet Hosea, which is found in the Christian Bible: "My people perish for lack of knowledge." Some may already have heard my expose of the foreign aid scandal, in which work I named several conspiratorial organizations, whose number is legion. Their final objective was the overthrow of the U.S. Constitution and the merging of this country, chosen by God as his country, with a godless one world new world order government which will return the world to conditions far worse than existed in the Dark Ages. Let us talk about actual case histories, the attempt to communize and deindustrialize Italy. The Committee of 300 long ago decreed that there shall be a smaller, much smaller and better world. That is, their idea of what constitutes a better world. The myriads of useless eaters consuming scarce natural resources were to be culled. Industrial progress supports population growth. Therefore, the command to multiply and subdue the earth found in Genesis had to be subverted. This called for an attack upon Christianity, the slow but sure disintegration of industrial nation-states, the destruction of hundreds of millions of people, referred to by the Committee of 300 as surplus population, and the removal of any leader who dared to stand in the way of the Committee's global planning to reach the foregoing objectives. Two of the Committee's earliest targets were Italy and Pakistan. The late Aldo Moro, Prime Minister of Italy, was one leader who opposed zero growth and population reductions planned for his country, thereby incurring the wrath of the Club of Rome commissioned by the Olympians to carry out its policies in this regard. In a Rome courtroom on November 10, 1982, a close friend of Moro's testified that the former prime minister was threatened by an agent of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIAA, who is also a Committee of 300 member while he was still the U.S. Secretary of State. The meteoric rise of the man the witness named as Kissinger will be dealt with later. It will be recalled that Prime Minister Moro was kidnapped by the Red Brigades in 1978 and subsequently brutally shot to death. It was at the trial of members of the Red Brigades that several of them testified to the fact that they knew of high-level U.S. involvement in the plot to kill Moro. When threatening Moro, Kissinger was obviously not carrying out U.S. foreign policy, but rather acting according to instructions received from the Club of Rome, the foreign policy arm of the Committee of 300. The witness who delivered the bombshell in open court was a close associate of Moro's, Corrado Guerzoni. His explosive testimony was broadcast over Italian television and radio on November 1982, and printed in several Italian newspapers, yet this vital information was suppressed in the U.S. Compelling Right to Know, the Washington Post and the New York Times did not think it important to even print a single line of Guerzoni's testimony, nor was the news carried by any of the wire services or television stations. The fact that Italy's Aldo Moro had been a leading politician for decades, and who was kidnapped in broad daylight in the spring of 1978, all of his bodyguards butchered in cold blood, was not deemed newsworthy, even though Kissinger stood accused as an accomplice to these crimes? Or was the silence because of Kissinger's involvement? In my 1982 expose of this heinous crime, I demonstrated that Aldo Moro, a loyal member of the Christian Democrat Party, was murdered by assassins controlled by P2 Masonry, with the object of bringing Italy into line with Club of Rome orders to deindustrialize the country and considerably reduce its population. Moro's plans to stabilize Italy through full employment and industrial and political peace would have strengthened Catholic opposition to communism and made the destabilization of the Middle East a prime goal that much harder. From the foregoing, it becomes clear just how far ahead the conspirators plan. They do not think in terms of a 5-year plan. One needs to go back to Weishaupt's statements about the early Catholic Church to understand what was involved in the murder of Aldo Moro. Moro's death removed the roadblocks to the plans to destabilize Italy, and as we now know, enabled conspiracy plans for the Middle East to be carried out in the Gulf War 14 years later. Italy was chosen as a test target by the Committee of 300. Italy is important to the conspirators' plans because it is the closest European country to the Middle East linked to Middle East economics and politics. It is also the home of the Catholic Church, which Weishaupt ordered destroyed, and home for some of Europe's most powerful top oligarchical families of the ancient black nobility. Should Italy have been weakened by Moro's death, it would have had repercussions in the Middle East which would have weakened U.S. influence in the region. Italy is important for another reason. It is a gateway for drugs entering Europe from Iran and Lebanon, and we shall return to that subject in due course. Various groups had combined under the name of socialism to bring about the downfall of several Italian governments since the Club of Rome was established in 1968. Among these are the black nobility of Venice and Genoa, P2 Masonry, and the Red Brigades, all working for the same goals. Police investigators in Rome working on the Red Brigade's Aldo Moro case came across the names of several very prominent Italian families working closely with this terrorist group. The police also discovered evidence that in at least a dozen cases, these powerful and prominent families had allowed their homes and or property to be used as safe houses for Red Brigade cells. America's nobility were doing their share to destroy the Republic of Italy, a notable contribution having come from Richard Gardner even while in his official capacity as President Carter's ambassador to Rome. Direct control of Bettino Craxi, an important member of the Club of Rome and a key man in NATO. Craxi was the leading edge of the conspirators' attempts to destroy the Italian Republic. As we shall see, Craxi was almost successful in ruining Italy, and as the conspirators' hierarchy's leading player, was able to get divorce and abortion pushed through the Italian parliament, resulting in the most far-reaching and destructive religious and social changes ever to strike at the Catholic Church, and consequently, the morals of the Italian nation. After President Ronald Reagan was elected, an important meeting was held in Washington, D.C. in December 1980 under the auspices of the Club of Rome and the Socialist International. Both these organizations are directly responsible to the Committee of 300. The main agenda was to formulate ways and means of how to neutralize the Reagan presidency. A group plan was adopted, and as we look back, it is perfectly clear that the plan the conspirators agreed to follow has been very successful. In order to get an idea of how vast and how all-pervasive is this conspiracy, it would be appropriate at this point to name the goals set by the Committee of 300 for the pending conquest and control of the world. There are at least 40 known branch offices of the Committee of 300, and we shall be listing them all, together with a description of their functions. Once this is studied, it becomes easy to understand how one central conspiratorial body is able to operate so successfully, and why it is that no power on earth can withstand their onslaught against the very foundations of a civilized, progressive world, based on freedom of the individual, especially as it is declared in the United States Constitution. Thanks to the sworn testimony of Guerzoni, Italy and Europe, but not the U.S. learned that Kissinger was behind the death of Aldo Moro. This tragic affair demonstrates the ability of the Committee of 300 to impose its will upon any government without exception. Secure in his position as a member of the most powerful secret society in the world, and I am not talking about Freemasonry, Kissinger not only terrified Morrow, but carried through on his threats to eliminate Morrow if he did not give up his plan to bring economic and industrial progress to Italy. In June and July of 1982, the wife of Aldo Moro testified in open court that her husband's murder came about as a result of serious threats against his life, made by what she called a high-ranking United States political figure. Mrs. Eleonora Moro repeated the precise phrase reportedly used by Kissinger in the sworn testimony of Guerzoni: "Either you stop your political line, or you will pay dearly for it." Recalled by the judge, Guerzoni was asked if he could identify the person Mrs. Moro was talking about. Guerzoni replied that it was indeed Henry Kissinger, as he had previously intimated. Guerzoni went on to explain to the court that Kissinger had made his threats in Moro's hotel room during the Italian leader's official visit to the U.S. Moro, then Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Italy. A NATO member country, was a man of high rank, one who should never have been subjected to mafia-like pressures and threats. Moro was accompanied on his American visit by the President of Italy in his official capacity. Kissinger was then, and still is, an important agent in the service of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, a member of the Club of Rome and the Council on Foreign Relations. Kissinger's role in destabilizing the United States by means of 3 wars, the Middle East, Korea, and Vietnam, is well known, as is his role in the Gulf War, in which the U.S. Army acted as mercenaries for the Committee of 300 in bringing Kuwait back under its control, and at the same time making an example out of Iraq, so that other small nations would not be tempted to work out their own destiny. Kissinger also threatened the late Ali Bhutto, president of the sovereign nation of Pakistan. Bhutto's crime was that he favored nuclear weapons for his country. As a Muslim state, Pakistan felt threatened by continued Israeli aggression in the Middle East. Bhutto was judicially murdered in 1979 by the Council on Foreign Relations representative in the country, General Zia-ul-Haq. In his planned ascent to power, ul-Haq encouraged a frenzied mob to set fire to the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad in an apparent attempt to show the CFR that he was his own man, and to secure more foreign aid, and, it was later learned, to murder Richard Helms. Several years later, ul-Haq paid with his life for intervening in the war raging in Afghanistan. His C-130 Hercules aircraft was hit by an ELF, electric frequency, shot shortly after it took off, causing the aircraft to loop into the ground. The Club of Rome, acting on Committee of 300 orders to eliminate General ul-Haq, had no compunction in sacrificing the lives of a number of U.S. servicemen on board the flight, including a U.S. Army Defense Intelligence Agency group headed by Brigadier General Heber Wassam. General ul-Haq had been warned by the Turkish Secret Service not to travel by plane, as he was targeted for a mid-air bombing. With this in mind, ul-Haq took the United States team with him as an insurance policy, as he commented to his inner circle advisors. In my 1989 work Terror in the Skies, I gave the following account of what happened. Shortly before ul-Haq's C-130 took off from a Pakistan military base, a suspicious-looking truck was seen close to the hangar that had housed the C-130. The control tower warned base security, but by the time action was taken, the C-130 was already airborne and the truck had gone. A few minutes later, the plane began looping the loop until it hit the ground and exploded in a ball of fire. There is no explanation for such behavior by the C-130, an aircraft with a marvelously reliable record, and a joint Pakistan-United States Board of Inquiry found no pilot error or mechanical or structural failure. Looping the loop is a recognized trademark of an aircraft hit by ELF fire. That the Soviet Union has been able to develop high-peak radio frequency devices is known to the West through the work of Soviet scientists who work in the Kurchatov Atomic Energy Institute's Intensive Relativistic Electron Beam Division. 2 of its specialists were Y.A. Vinogradov and A.A. Ruckhads. Both scientists worked in the Lebedev Physics Institute, which specializes in electronic and X-ray lasers. material which appeared to confirm the information given to me about the method chosen to shoot down General Ulhack's C-130. In addition, the information was confirmed by two of my intelligence sources. I received some useful information from a Soviet scientific paper on these subjects, published in England under the title Soviet Radio Electronics and Communication Systems. There was no doubt in my mind that General Ulhack had been murdered. The truck seen near the C-130 hangar undoubtedly carried a mobile ELF device of the type the Soviet armed forces are known to possess. According to written testimony by Butto, smuggled out of the country while he was in prison, Kissinger severely threatened him. "I will make a horrible example if you continue with your nation-building policies." Butto had fallen afoul of Kissinger and the Club of Rome by calling for a nuclear energy program to bring Pakistan into a modern industrialized state, which, in the eyes of the Committee of 300, was a direct contravention of its orders delivered by Kissinger to the Pakistani government. What Kissinger was doing when he threatened Butto was not official U.S. policy, but the policy of the modern-day Illuminati. One needs to have a clear understanding of just why it is that nuclear power is so hated all over the world, and why the fake environmentalist movement, established and financially supported by the Club of Rome, was called upon to wage war on nuclear energy. With nuclear energy generating electricity in cheap and abundant supplies, Third World countries would gradually become independent of U.S. foreign aid and begin to assert their sovereignty. Nuclear-generated electricity is the key to bringing Third World countries out of their backward state, a state which the Committee of 300 has ordered to remain in position. Less foreign aid means less control of a country's natural resources by the IMF. It was this idea of developing nations taking charge of their destiny that was an anathema to the Club of Rome and its ruling Committee of 300. We have seen opposition to nuclear power in the United States successfully used to block industrial development in conformity with the Club's post-industrial zero growth plans. Dependence upon U.S. foreign aid actually keeps foreign countries in servitude to the Council on Foreign Relations. The people of the recipient countries receive very little of the money, as it usually ends up in the pockets of government leaders, who allow the natural raw material assets of the country to be savagely stripped by the IMF. Mugabe of Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, is a good example of how raw material assets, in this case high-grade chrome ore, is controlled through foreign aid. LONRHO, the giant conglomerate run by Angus Ogilvy, an important member of the Committee of 300, on behalf of his cousin, Queen Elizabeth II, now has total control of this valuable resource while the people of the country sink ever deeper into poverty and misery, notwithstanding a handout of in excess of $300 million from the United States. LONRHO now has a monopoly of Rhodesian chrome and charges any price it likes, whereas, under the Smith government, this was not allowed. A reasonable price level was maintained for 25 years prior to the Mugabe regime taking power. Were problems during the 14-year rule of Ian Smith. Since his departure, unemployment has quadrupled, and Zimbabwe is in a state of chaos and de facto bankruptcy. Mugabe received enough foreign aid from the U.S., in the region of $300 million per annum, to enable him to build 3 hotels on the French Côte d'Azur, Cap Ferret and Monte Carlo, while his citizens grapple with disease, unemployment and malnutrition, not to mention an iron-fisted dictatorship that allows no complaints. Contrast this with the Smith government, which never asked for nor received 1 red cent in aid from the United States. Thus it is clear that foreign aid is a powerful means of exercising control of countries such as Zimbabwe and indeed all African countries. It also keeps U.S. citizens in a state of involuntary servitude and therefore less able to mount meaningful opposition to government. David Rockefeller knew what he was doing when his foreign aid bill became law in 1946. It has, since then, become one of the most hated laws on the statute books following public exposure of what it is a racket run by government and paid for by we, the people. How can the conspirators maintain their grip upon the world, and more especially, their chokehold over the U.S. and Britain? One of the most asked questions is, How can any single entity know at all times what is going on and how is control exercised? This book will attempt to answer these and other questions. The only way we can come to grips with the reality of the conspirators' success is by mentioning and discussing the secret societies, front organizations, government agencies, banks, insurance companies, international businesses, the petroleum industry, and the hundreds of thousands of entities and foundations whose leading lights make up the membership of the Committee of 300, the ultimate controlling body that runs the world, and has done so for at least 100 years. Since there already are scores of books on the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and the Trilaterals, we shall go directly to the Club of Rome and the German Marshall Fund. When I introduced these organizations to the United States, few, if any, had heard of them. My first work, The Club of Rome, published in 1983, attracted almost no attention. Many uninitiated people thought the Club of Rome was something to do with the Catholic Church, and that the German Marshall Fund referred to the Marshall Plan. This is precisely why the committee chose these names, to confuse and to deflect attention away from what was happening. Not that the U.S. government didn't know, but as it was part of the conspiracy, it helped to keep the lid on information rather than let the truth be known. A few years after I published my work, a few writers saw in it a wealth of hitherto untapped information and began writing and talking about it as though they had always had full knowledge of it. It came as a revelation to them that the Club of Rome and its financiers under the title of the German Marshall Fund were two highly organized conspiratorial bodies operating under cover of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and that the majority of Club of Rome executives were drawn from NATO. Member Lord Carrington was able to split NATO into two factions, a political left-wing power group and its former military alliance. The Club of Rome is still one of the most important foreign policy arms of the Committee of 300, the other being the Bilderbergers. It was put together in 1968 from hardcore members of the original Morgenthau Group on the basis of a telephone call made by the late Aurelio Pexi for a new and urgent drive to speed up the plans of the one world government now called the New World Order, although I prefer the former name. It is certainly a better job description than the New World Order, which is somewhat confusing as there have been several New World Orders before, but no one world government. Pexi's call was answered by the most subversive future planners drawn from the United States, France, Sweden, Britain, Switzerland, and Japan that could be mustered. During the period 1968-1972, the Club of Rome became a cohesive entity of new science scientists, globalists, future planners, and internationalists of every stripe. As one delegate put it, we became Joseph's coat of many colors. Pexi's book, Human Quality, formed the basis of the doctrine adopted by NATO's political wing. The following is extracted from Dr. Pexi's book, Human Quality. For the first time since the first millennium was approached in Christendom, large masses of people are really in suspense about the impending advent of something unknown which could change their collective fate entirely. Man does not know how to be a truly modern man. Man invented the story of the bad dragon, but if ever there was a bad dragon, it is man himself. Here we have the human paradox, man trapped by his extraordinary capacity and achievements, as in a quicksand the more he uses his power the more he needs it. We must never tire of repeating how foolish it is to equate the present profound pathological state and maladjustment of the entire human system to any cyclic crisis or passing circumstances. Since man has opened Pandora's box of new technologies, he has suffered uncontrolled human proliferation, the mania for growth, energy crises, actual or potential resource scarcities, degradation of environment, nuclear folly, and a host of related afflictions. This is identical to the program adopted by the much later fake environmentalist movement spawned by the same Club of Rome to blunt and turn back industrial development. Broadly, the anticipated counter-program of the Club of Rome would cover inventing and disseminating post-industrialization ideas in the United States, coupled with the spread of counterculture movements such as drugs, rock, sex, hedonism, Satanism, witchcraft, and environmentalism. Advisors and played a guiding role in NATO's attempt to adopt the Aquarian conspiracy. The name, New World Order, is seen as something developed as a consequence of the Gulf War in 1991, whereas the One World Government is recognized as being centuries old. The New World Order is not new. It has been around and developing under one or another guise for a very long time, but it is perceived as a development of the future, which is not the case. The New World Order is past and present. That is why I said earlier that the term One World Government is, or ought to be, preferred. Aurelio Pexi once confided in his close friend Alexander Haig that he felt like Adam Weishaupt reincarnated. Pexi had much of Weishaupt's brilliant ability to organize and control the Illuminati of today, and it showed through in Pexi's control of NATO and formulating its policies on a global scale. Pexi headed the Atlantic Institute's Economic Council for 3 decades, while he was the chief executive officer for Giovanni Agnelli's Fiat Motor Company. Agnelli, a member of an ancient Italian black nobility family of the same name, is one of the most important members of the Committee of 300. He played a leading role in development projects in the Soviet Union. The Club of Rome is a conspiratorial umbrella organization, a marriage between Anglo-American financiers and the old black nobility families of Europe, particularly the so-called nobility of London, Venice, and Genoa. The key to the successful control of the world is their ability to create and manage savage economic recessions and eventual depressions. The Committee of 300 looks to social convulsions on a global scale, followed by depressions, as a softening-up technique for bigger things to come, as its principal method of creating masses of people all over the world who will become its welfare recipients of the future. The committee appears to base much of its important decisions affecting mankind on the philosophy of Polish aristocrat Felix Dzerzhinsky, who regarded mankind as being slightly above the level of cattle. As a close friend of British intelligence agent Sidney Riley, Riley was actually Dzerzhinsky's controller during the Bolshevik Revolution's formative years. He often confided in Riley during his drinking bouts. Dzerzhinsky was, of course, the beast who ran the Red Terror apparatus. He once told Riley, while the two were on a drinking binge, that man is of no importance. Look at what happens when you starve him. He begins to eat his dead companions to stay alive. Man is only interested in his own survival. That is all that counts. All the Spinoza stuff is a lot of rubbish. The Club of Rome has its own private intelligence agency and also borrows from David Rockefeller's Interpol. Every U.S. intelligence agency cooperates very closely with it, as does the KGB and the Mossad. The only agency that remained beyond its reach was the East German Intelligence Service, the SDASSY. The Club of Rome also has its own highly organized political and economic agencies. Committee of 300 member. Volcker stayed on as Federal Reserve Board chairman, notwithstanding the faithful promise of candidate Reagan that he would dismiss him as soon as he, Reagan, was elected. The Club of Rome, after playing a key role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, attempted to sell its crisis management, the forerunner of FEMA, program to President Kennedy. Several Tavistock scientists went to see the president to explain what it meant, but the president rejected the advice they gave. The same year that Kennedy was murdered, Tavistock was back in Washington to talk with NASA. This time the talks were successful. Tavistock was given a contract by NASA to evaluate the effect of its coming space program on American public opinion. The contract was farmed to the Stanford Research Institute and the Rand Corporation. Much of the material produced by Tavistock, Stanford, and Rand never saw the light of day and remained sealed until now. Several Senate oversight committees and subcommittees I approached to obtain information told me they had never heard of it, nor did they have the slightest idea where I might find what I was seeking. Such is the power and prestige of the Committee of 300. In 1966, I was advised by my intelligence colleagues to approach Dr. Anatol Rappaport, who had written a treatise in which the administration was said to be interested. It was a paper intended to bring an end to NASA's space program, which Rappaport said had outlived its usefulness. Rappaport was quite happy to give me a copy of his paper which, without going into fine detail, basically claimed that NASA's space program should be scrapped. NASA has too many scientists who were exerting a bad influence on America because they were always eager to lecture schools and university audiences on how rocketry worked, from construction to propulsion. Rappaport claimed that this would produce a generation of adults who would decide to become space scientists, only to find themselves redundant, as no one would need their services by the year 2000. No sooner had Rappaport's profiling report on NASA been presented to NATO by the Club of Rome than the Committee of 300 demanded action. NATO Club of Rome officials charged with urgent anti-NASA action were Harland Cleveland, Joseph Slater, Claiborne K. Pell, Walter J. Levy, George McGee, William Watts, Robert Strauss Hupe, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and Donald Lesh. In May 1967, a meeting was organized by the Scientific and Technological Committee of the North Atlantic Assembly and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. It was called Conference on Transatlantic Imbalance and Collaboration, and it was held at Queen Elizabeth's palatial property in Deauville, France. The basic purpose and intent of the conference at Deauville was to end U.S. technological and industrial progress. Out of the conference came two books, one of which is mentioned herein, Brzezinski's Technotronic Era. The other was written by conference chairman Aurelio Pecci, entitled The Chasm Ahead. Pecci largely agreed with Brzezinski, but added that their world be chaos in a future world not ruled by a one-world government. Must be offered a convergence with NATO, such a convergence ending in an equal partnership in a new world order with the United States. Both nations would be responsible for future crisis management and global planning. The first Club of Rome's global planning contract went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology MIT, one of the premier committee of 300's research institutes. J. Forrester and Dennis Meadows were placed in charge of the project. What was their report all about? It did not differ fundamentally from what Malthus and von Hayek preached, namely the old question of not enough natural resources to go around. The Forrester-Meadows report was a complete fraud. What it did not say was that man's proven inventive genius would in all likelihood work its way around shortages. Fusion energy, the deadly enemy of the Committee of 300, could be applied to creating natural resources. A fusion torch could produce from 1 square mile of ordinary rock enough aluminum, for example, to fill our needs for 4 years. Pecci never tired of preaching against the nation-state and how destructive they are for the progress of mankind. He called for collective responsibility. Nationalism was a cancer on man was the theme of several important speeches delivered by Pecci. His close friend Ervin Laszlo produced a work in 1977 in a similar vein which was called Goals of Mankind, a landmark study for the Club of Rome. The entire position paper was a vitriolic attack on industrial expansion and urban growth. Throughout these years, Kissinger, as the designated contact man, kept in close touch with Moscow on behalf of the RIIA. Global modeling papers were regularly shared with Kissinger's friends in the Kremlin. With regard to the Third World, the Club of Rome's Harland Cleveland prepared a report which was the height of cynicism. At the time, Cleveland was United States ambassador to NATO. Essentially, the paper said it would be up to Third World nations to decide among themselves which populations should be eliminated. As Pecci later wrote based on the Cleveland report, damaged by conflicting policies of 3 major countries and blocs, roughly patched up here and there, the existing international economic order is visibly coming apart at the seams. The prospect of the necessity of the recourse to triage deciding who must be saved is a very grim one indeed. But if lamentably events should come to such a pass, the right to make such decisions cannot be left to just a few nations, because it would lend themselves to ominous power over life of the world's hungry. In this is found the committee policy of deliberately starving African nations to death, as evidenced in the sub-Saharan nations. This was cynicism at its worst, because the Committee of 300 had already abrogated the decisions of life and death unto itself, and Pecci knew it. He had previously so indicated in his book Limits of Growth. Pecci completely dismissed industrial and agricultural progress, and in its place demanded that the world come under one coordinating council, to wit, the Club of Rome and its NATO institutions, in a one-world government. Natural resources would have to be allocated under the auspices of global planning. Nation-states could either accept Club of Rome domination or else survive by the law of the jungle and fight to survive. In its first test case, Meadows and Forrester planned the 1973 Arab-Israeli War on behalf of the RIA to sharply bring home to the world that natural resources like petroleum would in the future come under global planners' control, meaning, of course, under the control of the Committee of 300. Tavistock Institute called for a consultation with Pexy, to which George Bundy, Homer Perlmutter, and Dr. Alexander King were invited. From London, Pexy traveled to the White House where he met with the President and his cabinet, followed by a visit to the State Department where he conferred with the Secretary of State, the State Department's Intelligence Service, and State's Policy Planning Council. Thus, from the very beginning, the United States government was fully aware of the Committee of 300's plans for this country. That should answer the often asked question: why would our government allow the Club of Rome to operate in a subversive manner in the United States? Volcker's economic and monetary policies were a reflection of those of Sir Geoffrey Howe, Chancellor of the Exchequer and member of the Committee of 300. This serves to illustrate how Britain has controlled the United States, beginning from soon after the War of 1812, and continues to exercise control over this country through the policies of the Committee of 300. What are the goals of the secret elite group, the inheritors of Illuminism, Moriah conquering wind, the cult of Dionysius, the cult of Isis, Catharism, Bogomilism? This elite group that also calls itself the Olympians, they truly believe they are equal in power and stature to the legendary gods of Olympus, who have, like Lucifer their god, set themselves above our true God, absolutely believe they have been charged with implementing the following by divine right. 1. A one-world government, new world order with a unified church and monetary system under their direction. Not many people are aware that the one-world government began setting up its church in the 1920s, 1930s, for they realized the need for a religious belief inherent in mankind to have an outlet and therefore set up a church body to channel that belief in the direction they desired. 2. The utter destruction of all national identity and national pride. 3. The destruction of religion and more especially the Christian religion, with the one exception, their own creation mentioned above. 4. Control of each and every person through means of mind control, and what Brzezinski called technotronics, which would create human-like robots and a system of terror beside which Felix Dzerzhinsky's Red Terror will look like children at play. 5. An end to all industrialization and the production of nuclear-generated electric power in what they call the post-industrial zero-growth society. Exempted are the computer and service industries. United States industries that remain will be exported to countries such as Mexico, where abundant slave labor is available. Unemployables in the wake of industrial destruction will either become opium, heroin, and/or cocaine addicts, or become statistics in the elimination process we know today as Global 2000. 6. Legalization of drugs and pornography. 7. Depopulation of large cities according to the trial run carried out by the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. It is interesting to note that Pol Pot's genocidal plans were drawn up here in the United States by one of the Club of Rome's research foundations. It is also interesting that the committee is presently seeking to reinstate the Pol Pot butchers in Cambodia. 8. Suppression of all scientific development except for those deemed beneficial by the committee. Especially targeted is nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Particularly hated are the fusion experiments presently being scorned and ridiculed by the committee and its jackals of the press. Development of the fusion torch would blow the committee's conception of limited natural resources right out of the window. A fusion torch properly used could create unlimited, untapped natural resources from the most ordinary substances. Fusion torch uses are legion and would benefit mankind in a manner which is as yet not even remotely comprehended by the public. 9. Caused by means of limited wars in the advanced countries, and by means of starvation and diseases in third world countries, the death of 3 billion people by the year 2000, people they call useless eaters. The Committee of 300 commissioned Cyrus Vance to write a paper on this subject of how best to bring about such genocide. The paper was produced under the title The Global 2000 Report and was accepted and approved for action by President Carter, for and on behalf of the U.S. government, and accepted by Edwin Muskie, then Secretary of State. Under the terms of the Global 2000 report, the population of the United States is to be reduced by 100 million by the year 2050. Tend to weaken the moral fiber of the nation and to demoralize workers in the labor class by creating mass unemployment. As jobs dwindle due to the post-industrial zero-growth policies introduced by the Club of Rome, demoralized and discouraged workers will resort to alcohol and drugs. The youth of the land will be encouraged by means of rock music and drugs to rebel against the status quo, thus undermining and eventually destroying the family unit. In this regard, the Committee of 300 commissioned Tavistock Institute to prepare a blueprint as to how this could be achieved. Tavistock directed Stanford Research to undertake the work under the direction of Professor Willis Harman. This work later became known as the Aquarian Conspiracy. 11. To keep people everywhere from deciding their own destinies by means of one created crisis after another and then managing such crises. Massive scale will result. In the case of the United States, an agency for crisis management is already in place. It is called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, whose existence I first disclosed in 1980. There will be more on FEMA as we proceed. 12. To introduce new cults and continue to boost those already functioning, which includes rock music gangsters such as the filthy, degenerate Mick Jagger's Rolling Stones, a gangster group much favored by European black nobility, and all of the Tavistock-created rock groups which began with the Beatles. To continue to build up the cult of Christian fundamentalism begun by the British East India Company's servant, Darby, which will be misused to strengthen the Zionist state of Israel through identifying with the Jews through the myth of God's chosen people, and by donating very substantial amounts of money to what they mistakenly believe is a religious cause in the furtherance of Christianity. 14. To press for the spread of religious cults such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim fundamentalism, the Sikhs, and to carry out experiments of the Jim Jones and Son of Sam type of murders. It is worth noting that the late Ayatollah Khomeini was a creation of British Intelligence Military Intelligence Division 6, commonly known as M16, as I reported in my 1985 work, What Really Happened in Iran. 15. To export religious liberation ideas around the world so as to undermine all existing religions, but more especially the Christian religion. This began with Jesuit liberation theology, which brought about the downfall of the Somoza family rule in Nicaragua, and which is today destroying El Salvador, now 25 years into a civil war, Costa Rica and Honduras. One very active entity engaged in so-called liberation theology is the communist-oriented Mary Knoll Mission. This accounts for the extensive media attention to the murder of 4 of Mary Knoll's so-called nuns in El Salvador a few years ago. The 4 nuns were communist subversive agents, and their activities were widely documented by the government of El Salvador. The United States press and news media refused to give any space or coverage to the massive documentation in possession of the Salvadorian government, documentation which proves what the Mary Knoll Mission nuns were doing in the country. Mary Knoll is in service in many countries and played a leading role in bringing communism to Rhodesia, Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa. 16. To cause a total collapse of the world's economies and engender total political chaos. 17. To take control of all foreign and domestic policies of the United States. 18. To give the fullest support to supranational institutions such as the United Nations, UN, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, the World Court, and as far as possible, make local institutions of lesser effect by gradually phasing them out or bringing them under the mantle of the United Nations. 19. Penetrate and subvert all governments, and work from within them to destroy the sovereign integrity of nations represented by them. 20. Organize a worldwide terrorist apparatus and negotiate with terrorists whenever terrorist activities take place. It will be recalled that it was Bettino Craxi who persuaded the Italian and U.S. governments to negotiate with the Red Brigade's kidnappers of Prime Minister Mauro and General Dozier. As an aside, General Dozier is under orders not to talk about what happened to him. Should he break that silence, he will no doubt be made a horrible example of in the manner in which Kissinger dealt with Aldo Moro Ali Bhutto and Gen Iral Zia-ul-Haq. 21. Take control of education in America with the intent and purpose of utterly and completely destroying it. Much of these goals, which I first enumerated in 1969, have since been achieved or are well on their way to being achieved. Of special interest in the Committee of 300 program is the core of their economic policy, which is largely based on the teachings of Malthus, the son of an English country parson who was pushed to prominence by the British East India Company, upon which the Committee of 300 is modeled. Malthus maintained that man's progress is tied to the Earth's natural ability to support a given number of people, beyond which point Earth's limited resources would rapidly be depleted. Once these natural resources have been consumed, it will be impossible to replace them. Hence, Malthus observed, it is necessary to limit populations within the boundaries of decreasing natural resources. It goes without saying that the elite will not allow themselves to be threatened by a burgeoning population of useless eaters, hence culling must be practiced. As I have previously stated, culling is going on today, using the methods mandated in the Global 2000 report. All economic plans of the committee meet at the crossroads of Malthus and Friedrich von Hayek, another doom and gloom economist who is sponsored by the Club of Rome. The Austrian-born von Hayek has long been under the control of David Rockefeller, and von Hayek theories are fairly widely accepted in the United States. According to von Hayek, the United States economic platform must be based on A. Urban black markets, B. Small Hong Kong-type industries utilizing sweatshop labor, C. The tourist trade, D. Free enterprise zones where speculators can operate unhindered and where the drug trade can flourish, E. End of all industrial activity, and F. Close down all nuclear energy plants. Von Hayek's ideas dovetail perfectly with those of the Club of Rome, which is perhaps why he is so well promoted in right-wing circles in this country. The mantle of von Hayek is being passed to a new, younger economist, Geoffrey Sachs, who was sent to Poland to take up where von Hayek left off. It will be recalled that the Club of Rome organized the Polish economic crisis, which led to political destabilization of the country. But if widespread opposition is encountered, the old price support system will quickly be restored. The Committee of 300 ordered the Club of Rome to use Polish nationalism as a tool to destroy the Catholic Church and pave the way for Russian troops to reoccupy the country. The Solidarity movement was a creation of the Committee of 300's Zbigniew Brzezinski, who chose the name for the trade union and selected its office holders and organizers. Solidarity is no labor movement, although Gdansk shipyard workers were used to launch it, but rather, it was a high-profile political organization, created to bring forced changes in preparation for the advent of the one-world government. Most of Solidarity's leaders were descendants of Bolshevik Jews from Odessa and were not noted for hating communism. This helps to understand the saturation coverage provided by the American news media. Professor Sachs has taken the process a step further, ensuring economic slavery for a Poland recently freed from the domination of the USSR. Poland will now become the economic slave of the United States. All that has happened is that the master has changed. Brzezinski is the author of a book that should have been read by every American interested in the future of this country. Entitled The Technotronic Era, it was commissioned by the Club of Rome. The book is an open announcement of the manner and methods to be used to control the United States in the future. It also gave notice of cloning and robotoids, i.e. people who acted like people and who seemed to be people, but who were not. Brzezinski, speaking for the Committee of 300, said the United States was moving into an era unlike any of its predecessors. We were moving toward a technotronic era that could easily become a dictatorship. I reported fully on the technotronic era in 1981 and mentioned it in my newsletters a number of times. Brzezinski went on to say that our society is now in an information revolution based on amusement focus, spectator spectacles, saturation coverage by television of sporting events, which provide an opiate for an increasingly purposeless mass. Was Brzezinski another seer and a prophet? Could he see into the future? The answer is no. What he wrote in his book was simply copied from the Committee of 300's blueprint given to the Club of Rome for execution. Isn't it true that by 1991 we already have a purposeless mass of citizens? We could say that 30 million unemployed and 4 million homeless people are a purposeless mass, or at least the nucleus of one. In addition to religion, the opiate of the masses, which Lenin and Marx acknowledged was needed, we now have the opiates of mass spectator sport, unbridled sexual lusts, rock music, and a whole new generation of drug addicts. Mindless sex and an epidemic of drug usage was created to distract people from what is happening all around them. In the technotronic era, Brzezinski talks about the masses, as if people are some inanimate object, which is possibly how we are viewed by the Committee of 300. He continually refers to the necessity of controlling us, masses. At one point, he lets the cat out of the bag. At the same time, the capacity to assert social and political control over the individual will vastly increase. It will soon be possible to assert almost continuous control over every citizen and to maintain up-to-date files, containing even the most personal details about health and personal behavior of every citizen, in addition to the more customary data. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. Power will gravitate into the hands of those who control information. Our existing institutions will be supplanted by pre-crisis management institutions, the task of which will be to identify in advance likely social crises and to develop programs to cope with them. This describes the structure of FEMA, which came much later. This will encourage tendencies through the next several decades toward a technotronic era, a dictatorship, leaving even less room for political procedures as we know them. Finally, looking ahead to the end of the century, the possibility of biochemical mind control and genetic tinkering with man, including beings which will function like men and reason like them as well, could give rise to some difficult questions. Brzezinski was not writing as a private citizen, but as Carter's national security advisor and a leading member of the Club of Rome, and a member of the Committee of 300, a member of the CFR, and as a member of the old Polish black nobility. His book explains how America must leave its industrial base behind and enter into what he called a distinct new historical era. What makes America unique is its willingness to experience the future, be it pop art or LSD. Today, America is the creative society. The others, consciously or unconsciously, are emulative. What he should have said was that America is the proving ground for Committee of 300 policies which lead directly to dissolution of the old order and an entry into the one world government new world order. One of the chapters in the technotronic era explains how new technology will bring in its wake intense confrontation that will strain social and international peace. Oddly enough, we are already under intense strains through surveillance. Lured in Cuba is one place where this is happening. The other is NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, where a giant computer designated 666 can store data of every type mentioned by Brzezinski, plus possessing an expanded capacity to take in data for several billions more people than presently exist, if it ever comes to that, but which, in the light of the Global 2000 genocidal report, will probably never need to be utilized. Retrieval of data will be simple in the United States, where Brzezinski and his committee of 300 colleagues could simply add Social Security and/or driver license numbers to 666 to provide the surveillance recording announced. Governments, including the government of the USSR, that there will be chaos unless the Committee of 300 takes complete control of preparations for the New World Order. Control will be exercised through our committee and through global planning and crisis management. I reported this factual information a few months after I received it in 1981. Another item I reported back then was that Russia had been invited to join the preparations for the co-ML-NG One World Government. When I wrote these things in 1981, the conspirators' global plans were already in an advanced state of preparedness. Looking back over the past 10 years, it can be seen just how rapidly the committee's plans have advanced. If the information provided in 1981 was alarming, then it should be even more alarming today as we near the final stages of the demise of the United States as we know it. With unlimited funding, with several hundred think tanks and 5,000 social engineers, the media banking and control of most governments a reality, we can see that we are tracing a problem of immense proportions, one that cannot be opposed by any nation at this time. As I have so often stated, we have been misled into believing that the problem I am talking about has its origin in Moscow. We have been brainwashed into believing that communism is the greatest danger we Americans are facing. This is simply not so. The greatest danger arises from the mass of traitors in our midst. Our Constitution warns us to be watchful of the enemy within our gates. These enemies are the servants of the Committee of 300 who occupy high positions within our governmental structure. The United States is where we must begin our fight to turn back the tide threatening to engulf us, and where we must meet and defeat these internal conspirators. The Club of Rome also had a direct hand in creating the 25-year-old war in El Salvador, as an integral part of the wider plan drawn up by Elliott Abrams of the U.S. State Department. It was Committee of 300 member Willy Brandt, leader of the Socialist International and a former Chancellor of West Germany, who paid for the final offensive by the Salvadorian guerrillas, which, fortunately, was not successful. El Salvador was chosen by the committee to turn Central America into a zone for a new 30-year war, which task was allocated to Kissinger to carry out under the innocuous title of the Andes Plan. Just to demonstrate how the conspirators operate across all national boundaries, the final offensive action planned by Willy Brandt came about as a result of a visit to Felipe González, who at the time was preparing himself for his Club of Rome-ordained role as Spain's future prime minister. Apart from myself and one or two of my intelligence colleagues and former colleagues, no one appeared to have heard of González before he surfaced in Cuba. González was the Club of Rome's case officer for El Salvador, and the first socialist to be elevated to political power in Spain since the death of General Franco. González was on his way to Washington to attend the Club of Rome Socialist Get Reagan meeting, which took place in December 1980. Present at the González-Castro meeting was the left-wing guerrilla Guillermo Ungo, run by the Institute for Policy Studies (IPS), the Committee of 300's most notorious Washington-based left-wing think tank. Ungo was run by an IPS fellow who died in a mysterious plane crash while en route from Washington to Havana to visit Castro. As most of us know, both the left and the right of the political spectrum is controlled by the same people, which will help to explain the fact that Ungo was a lifelong friend of the late Napoleon Duarte, leader of the right wing in El Salvador. It was after the Cuban meeting that the final offensive by the Salvadorian guerrillas was carried out. The polarizing of South America and the U.S. was a special assignment given to Kissinger by the Committee of 300. The Malvinas War, also known as the Falklands War, and the subsequent overthrow of the Argentine government, followed by economic chaos and political upheavals, were planned by Kissinger associates acting in concert with Lord Carrington, a top-ranking member of the Committee of 300. One of the principal Committee of 300 assets in the U.S., the Aspen Institute of Colorado, also helped plan events in Argentina, even as it did in the case of the fall of the Shah of Iran. Latin America is important to the United States, not only because we have so many mutual defense treaties with countries there, but also because it has the potential of providing a huge market for American exports of technology, heavy industrial equipment which world have galvanized many of our faltering companies and provided thousands of new jobs. This was to be prevented all costs, even if it meant 30 years of war. Instead of seeing this huge potential in a positive light, the Committee of 300 saw it as a dangerous threat to its post-industrial zero-growth U.S. plans, and immediately acted to make an example of Argentina, as a warning to other Latin American nations to forget any ideas they may have had to promote nationalism, independence, and sovereign integrity. This is the reason why so many Latin American countries turn to drugs as their sole means of support, which may very well have been the intention of the conspirators in the first place. Americans in general look down on Mexico, which is precisely the attitude with which the committee wants the people of the United States to regard Mexico. What we need to do is change our thinking about Mexico and South America in general. Mexico represents a potentially huge market for all types of U.S. goods, which could mean thousands of jobs for Americans and Mexicans alike. Transferring our industries south of the border and paying the maquiladores slave wages is not in the interests of either country. It benefits nobody but the Olympians. Mexico received most of its nuclear power technology from Argentina, but the Malvinas War put an end to that. The Club of Rome decreed back in 1986 that it would stop exports of nuclear technology to developing countries. Generating abundant cheap electricity, Mexico would have become the Germany of Latin America. Such a state of affairs would have been a disaster for the conspirators who have, by 1991, stopped all exports of nuclear technology except that destined for Israel. What the Committee of 300 has in mind for Mexico is a feudal peasantry, a condition that allows for easy management and looting of Mexican oil. A stable and prosperous Mexico can only be a plus for the United States. This is what the conspirators wish to prevent, so they have engaged in decades of innuendo, slander, and direct economic war on Mexico. Before former President López Portillo took office and nationalized the banks, Mexico was losing $200 million a day to capital flight, organized and orchestrated by the Committee of 300's representatives in banks and brokerage houses on Wall Street. If only we in the United States had statesmen and not politicians running the country, we could act together and set back the One World Government New World Order plans to return Mexico to a state of helplessness. If we were able to defeat the Club of Rome's plans for Mexico, it would come as a shock to the Committee of 300, a shock from which they would take a long time to recover. The inheritors of the Illuminati pose as great a threat to the United States as they do to Mexico. By seeking common ground with Mexican patriotic movements, we in the United States could forge a formidable force to be reckoned with. But such action requires leadership, and we are more lacking in leadership than in any other area of endeavor. The Committee of 300, through its many affiliated organizations, was able to nullify the Reagan presidency. Here is what Stuart Butler of the Heritage Foundation had to say on the subject. The right thought it had won in 1980, but in fact it have lost. What Butler was referring to was the situation in which the right found itself when it realized that every single position of importance in the Reagan administration was filled by Fabianist appointees recommended by the Heritage Foundation. Butler went on to say that Heritage would use right-wing ideas to impose left-wing radical principles upon the United States, the same radical ideas which Sir Peter Vickers Hall, top Fabianist in the U.S. and the #1 man at Heritage, had been openly discussing during the election year. Sir Peter Vickers Hall remained an active Fabianist even though he was running a conservative think tank. As a member of the British oligarchical Vickers armament manufacturing family, he had position and power. The Vickers family supplied both sides in the First World War and again during Hitler's rise to power. Vickers' official cover was the University of California's Urban and Regional Development Institute. He was a longtime confidant of British Labour leader and Committee of 300 member Anthony Wedgwood Benn. Both Vickers and Benn are integrated with the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, the premier brainwashing institution in the world. Vickers uses his Tavistock training to very good effect when speech-making. There are two Americas. One is the 19th century heavy industry-based society. The other is the growing post-industrial society, in some cases built on the shards of the old America. It is the crisis between these two worlds which will produce the economic and social catastrophe of the next decade. The two worlds are in fundamental opposition. They cannot coexist. In the end, the post-industrial world must crush and obliterate the other one. Remember, this speech was made in 1981, and we can see from the state of our economy and our industries just how accurate was Sir Peter's prediction. When concerned people ask me how long the 1991 recession will last, I refer them to Sir Peter's statements and add my own opinion that it will not end until 1995-1996, and even then what emerges will not be the America we knew in the 1960s and 1970s. That America has already been destroyed. I reported Sir Peter's speech in my newsletter soon after it was delivered. How prophetic it was, but then it was easy to predict a future already written for America by the Committee of 300 and its Executive Club of Rome. What was Sir Peter saying in a euphemistic manner? Translated into ordinary everyday English, He was saying that the old American way of life, our true and trusted Republican form of government based upon our Constitution, was going to be crushed by the New World Order. America as we knew it was going to have to go or be crushed to pieces. As I said, committee of 300 members often make themselves highly visible. Sir Peter was no exception. To make it clearly understood where he was coming from, Sir Peter rounded off his speech by declaring, "I am perfectly happy working with the Heritage Foundation and groups like that. True Fabians look to the new right to push through some of their more radical ideas. For more than a decade, the British population has been subject to a constant propaganda barrage of how it was on the industrial skids. All of this is true, but the net effect of the propaganda was to demoralize the population. Exactly as intended by the new science scientist at Tavistock. This will happen in the United States as the economy worsens. This demoralizing process is necessary to make people accept difficult choices. If there is no planning for the future or if constituencies block progress, there will be social chaos on a scale which is currently hard to imagine. The outlook for urban America is bleak. There is a possibility of doing something with the inner cities, but basically the cities will shrink and the manufacturing base will decline. This will produce social convulsions. Was Sir Peter a psychic, a magician of great report, or merely a charlatan fortune teller with a great deal of luck? The answer is none of these. All Sir Peter was doing was reading off the blueprint of the Committee of 300 Club of Rome for Slow Death of the United States as a former industrial giant. Haven't Sir Peter's predictions proved to be remarkably accurate? Indeed they have, almost down to the last word. It is worth noting that Sir Peter Vickers Hall's father-in-law, worked on the Stanford research paper, Changing Images of Man, from which much of the 3,000 pages of material advice sent to the Reagan administration was taken. Moreover, as a senior MJ6 British intelligence officer, Sir Peter Vickers was in a position to give Heritage a great deal of advance information. As a member of the Committee of 300 in NATO, Sir Peter Vickers was around when NATO directed the Club of Rome to develop a social program which would utterly change the direction in which America wanted to go. The Club of Rome, under Tavistock direction, ordered Stanford Research Institute (SRI) to develop such a program not only for America, but for every nation in the Atlantic Alliance and the OECD nations. It was Sir Peter's protege, Stuart Butler, who gave President Reagan 3,000 pages of recommendations, which no doubt contained some opinions expressed by Anthony Wedgwood Benn, a member of Parliament and a ranking member of the Committee of 300. Benn told members of the Socialist International who met in Washington on December 8, 1980, "You can thrive under Volcker's credit collapse if you profile Reagan to intensify the credit collapse." That Butler's advice was taken and applied to the Reagan administration can be seen in the collapse of the savings and loan and banking industries which accelerated under Reagan economic policies. While Benn called it profiling, he really meant that Reagan should be brainwashed. It is worth noting that von Hayek, who as a founder member of Heritage used his student, Milton Friedman, to preside over the Club of Rome's plans to deindustrialize America using the Reagan presidency to accelerate the collapse of first the steel industry, and then the auto and housing industries, for example. In this regard, a French black nobility member, Étienne d'Avignon, as a member of the Committee of 300, was assigned the task of collapsing the steel industry in this country. It is doubtful that any of the hundreds of thousands of steel workers and shipyard workers who have been without jobs for the past decade have ever heard of d'Avignon. I fully reported the d'Avignon Plan in April 1980, One Economic Review. Attending that fateful December 10th Club of Rome meeting in Washington, D.C., was a mystery man from Iran who turned out to be Bani Sadr, the Ayatollah Khomeini's special envoy. One speech in particular at the December 10th, 1980 conclave caught my attention, mainly because it came from François Mitterrand, a man the French establishment had discarded and thought to be washed up. But my intelligence source had previously told me that Mitterrand was in the process of being picked up, dusted off and returned to power, so what he said carried a good deal of weight for me. Industrial capitalist development is the opposite of freedom. We must put an end to it. The economic systems of the 20th and 21st century will use machines to crush man, first in the domain of nuclear energy, which is already producing formidable results. Mitterrand's return to the Élysée Palace was a great triumph for socialism. The Committee of 300 was powerful enough to predict happenings, and then make them happen by force, or by whatever means it took to make its point that it could crush any and all opposition even if, as in the case of Mitterrand, he had been totally rejected a few short days before by a discerning political power group in Paris. Another group representative at the December 1980 Washington meetings with observer status was John Graham, also known as Irwin Jewell, head of the Fact-Finding Committee of the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. The ADL is an outright British intelligence operation run by all three branches of British intelligence, that is, M16 and the JIO. Jewell's extensive bag of dirty tricks was garnered from the sewers of the East End of London. Jewell is still a member of the super-secret SIS, an elite James Bond type of operation. Let nobody underestimate the power of the ADL, nor its long reach. Jewell works closely with Hall and other Fabianists. He was singled out as useful to British intelligence while at Ruskin Labour College at Oxford University in England, the same communist education centre that gave us Milner, Rhodes, Burgess, Maclean, and Kim Philby. Oxford and Cambridge universities have long been the province of the sons and daughters of the elite, those whose parents belonged to the upper crust of British high society. While at Oxford, Jewell joined the Young People's Socialist League and was recruited by British intelligence shortly thereafter. Jewell was posted to the United States, where he came under the protection and sponsorship of one of the most insidious leftists in the country, Walter Lippmann. Lippmann founded and ran the League for Industrial Democracy and Students for Democratic Society, both leftist spoiler operations to set industrial workers at variance with what it called the capitalist class and management. Both of Lippmann's projects were an integral part of the Committee of 300 apparatus that stretched right across America, of which Lippmann was a most important member. Jewell has strong connections with the Justice Department and can secure FBI profiles of any person he targets. The Justice Department has orders to give Jewell everything he wants when he wants it. Most of Jewell's activities center around keeping an eye on right-wing groups and individuals. The ADL has an open door to the State Department and makes good use of state's impressive intelligence agency. The State Department has a layer of agents in the right wing, posing as fearless anti-Semitic fighters. There are 4 leaders in this group of informers, 3 of whom are discreet Jewish homosexuals. This spy group has been in operation for the past 2 decades. They publish virulently anti-Jewish newspapers and sell a wide variety of anti-Semitic books. One of the principal operators works out of Louisiana. A member of this group is a writer who is dearly beloved in Christian right-wing circles. The group and the individuals who go to make it up are under the protection of the ADL. Jewell was deeply involved in ABSCAM and is often called upon by law enforcement agencies to assist them in investigations and sting operations. Jewell was assigned to dog Reagan, in terms of the course laid out for the newly elected president by the Heritage Foundation, and to figuratively fire a few warning shots if Reagan looked like deviating or taking off his blinders at any time. Jewell helped to get rid of any troublesome right-wing advisor not beholden to Heritage for his or her job with the Reagan administration. Such a person was Ray Donovan, Reagan's Secretary of Labor, who was eventually removed from his post thanks to the dirty tricks department of the ADL. James Baker III, one of those on the list of 3,000 recommendations made by the Heritage Foundation, was the go-between who carried Jewell's messages of hate about Donovan to the president. Another important conspirator was Philip Agee, the so-called CIA defector. Although not a member of the committee, he was nevertheless its case officer for Mexico and run by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIIA, and the Council on Foreign Relations. For the record, nothing that happens in the U.S. happens without the sanction of the RIIA. It is a continuing and ongoing agreement first openly entered into. There were many such secret agreements before that, by Churchill and Roosevelt in 1938, under the terms of which U.S. intelligence services are obliged to share intelligence secrets with British intelligence. This is the basis of the so-called special relationship between the two countries about which Churchill and Lord Halifax boasted, and which special relationship was responsible for the U.S. fighting the Gulf War against Iraq for and on behalf of British interests, more especially British Petroleum, one of the most important companies in the Committee of 300 in which Queen Elizabeth's immediate family has a big stake. No intelligence activity has taken place since 1938 except through this special Joint Command structure. Philip Agee joined the CIA after graduating from Notre Dame, where he was inducted into its Jesuit Freemason ring. Agee first came to my attention in 1968 as the intelligence officer behind the riots at the University of Mexico. One of the most important things about the Mexican student riots was that they occurred at the same time as student rioting in New York, Bonn, Prague, and West Berlin. With the coordination expertise and its special intelligence network of which Interpol is an integral part, it is not as difficult as it might seem at first sight for the committee to set in motion carefully timed global actions, whether they be student rioting or deposing leaders of supposedly sovereign nations. It is all in a day's work for the Olympians. From Mexico, Agee moved on to align himself with Puerto Rican terrorist groups. During this time he became a trusted confidant of the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. It should not be imagined that while Agee was carrying out these operations, he was doing so as a rogue agent. On the contrary, he was working for the CIA all during these assignments. Trouble came when Castro's DGI, Cuban Intelligence Service, was able to turn him. Agee continued to work in his capacity as a member of the CIA until his double role was uncovered. This involved the biggest Soviet listening post in the West located at Lourdes, Cuba. Simultaneously, many a private phone conversation between a member of Congress and his mistress was picked up at Lourdes and used to telling effect. Although we are told today in 1991 that communism is dead, the United States has done nothing to close down the vast spy operation which sits on our doorstep. Incidentally, Lourdes has the capability of picking up even the weakest tempest signal, which is the type given off by a fax machine or an electric typewriter which, when deciphered, will give the contents of whatever is being typed or faxed. Lourdes remains dagger in the heart of the United States. There is absolutely no reason for its continued existence. If the US and USSR are truly at peace with each other, why the continued need for so massive a spy operation? The simple truth is that, rather than retrenching personnel as we are led to believe, the KGB has taken on additional recruits during 1990 and 1991. Bernard Levin is probably not a name that is well known in the United States. Unlike decadent pop stars or Hollywood's latest miserable discovery, academics seldom if ever come before the public eye. Of the hundreds of academics in the United States working under the control of the Club of Rome, Levin is worthy of special mention, if for no reason other than his role in undermining Iran, the Philippines, South Africa, Nicaragua, and South Korea. The demise of the Shah of Iran was run to a plan devised by Bernard Levin and Richard Falk, and supervised by Robert Anderson's Aspen Institute. Levin was the author of a work entitled Time, Perspective, and Morale, which is a Club of Rome publication concerning how to break down the morale of nations and individual leaders. Here is an extract of the document. One of the main techniques for breaking morale through a strategy of terror consists in exactly this tactic. Keep the person hazy as to where he stands and just what he may expect. In addition, if frequent vacillations between severe disciplinary measures and promise of good treatment together, with the spreading of contradictory news make the structure of the citoyen unclear, then the individual may cease to know whether a particular plan would lead toward or away from his goal. Under these conditions, even those individuals who have definite goals and are ready to take risks are paralyzed by the severe inner conflict in regard to what to do. This Club of Rome blueprint applies to countries as well as to individuals, particularly the government leaders of those countries. We in the U.S. need not think that, oh well, this is America, and those kinds of things just do not happen here. Let me assure you that they are happening in the U.S., and perhaps more so than in any other country. The Levin Club of Rome plan is designed to demoralize us all so that in the end we feel we should follow whatever it is that is planned for us. We will follow Club of Rome orders like sheep. Any seemingly strong leader who suddenly appears to rescue the nation must be regarded with the utmost suspicion. groomed for years by British intelligence, especially during his time in Paris, before he suddenly appeared as the savior of Iran. Boris Yeltsin is from the same M16 CIS stable. The Club of Rome feels confident that it has carried out its Committee of 300 mandate to soften up the United States. After 45 years of waging war on the people of this nation, who will doubt that it has indeed accomplished its task? Look around and see how we have been demoralized. Drugs, pornography, rock and roll, music, free sex, the family unit all but totally undermined, lesbianism, homosexuality, and finally the ghastly murder of millions of innocent babies by their own mothers. Has there ever been a crime so vile as mass abortion? With the U.S. spiritually, morally bankrupted, with our industrial base destroyed, throwing 30 million people out of work, with our big cities ghastly cesspools of every imaginable crime, with a murder rate almost 3 times higher than any other country, with 4 million homeless, with corruption in government reaching endemic proportions, who will gainsay that the United States is ready to collapse from within into the waiting arms of the new dark age one world government? The Club of Rome has succeeded in splitting the Christian churches. It has succeeded in building up an army of charismatics, fundamentalists, and evangelicals who will fight for the Zionist state of Israel. During the Gulf War of genocide, I received scores of letters asking me how I could oppose a just Christian war against Iraq. How could I doubt that Christian fundamentalist support for the Committee of 300's war against Iraq was not biblical? After all, didn't Billy Graham pray with President Bush just before the shooting started? Doesn't the Bible speak of wars and rumors of wars? These letters give an insight into just how well the Tavistock Institute has done its work. The Christian fundamentalists will be a formidable force behind the State of Israel, exactly as planned. How sad that these fine people do not realize that they have been grossly misused by the Club of Rome, and that their opinions and beliefs are not their own, but those created for them by the hundreds of Committee of 300 think tanks that dot the American landscape. In other words, like any other segment of the United States population, the Christian fundamentalists and evangelicals have been thoroughly brainwashed. We as a nation are ready to accept the demise of the United States of America and the American way of life, once the envy of the entire world. Do not think this has happened on its own. The old times are changing syndrome. Time does not change anything, people do. It is a mistake to think of the Committee of 300 and the Club of Rome as European institutions. The Club of Rome exercises great influence and power in the United States and has its own chapter based in Washington, D.C. Senator Claiborne Pell is its leader, and one of its members is Frank M. Potter, a one-time staff director of the House Subcommittee on Energy. It is not difficult to see how the Club of Rome has maintained its grip on U.S. energy policies and where environmentalist opposition to nuclear energy is coming from. Greatest success story is its hold over Congress in regard to nuclear energy, which has had the effect of preventing the U.S. from entering the 21st century as a strong industrial nation. The effect of the anti-nuclear policy of the Club of Rome can be measured in terms of silent blast furnaces, derelict railroad yards, rusting steel mills, shipyards long since closed down, and a valuable trained workforce scattered across the United States, which may never again be assembled. Other Club of Rome members in the U.S. are Walter A. Hahn of the Congressional Research Service, Ann Cheatham and Douglas Ross, both senior economists. Ross's task, in his own words, was to translate Club of Rome perspectives into legislation to help the country get away from the illusion of plenty. Ann Cheatham was the director of an organization called Congressional Clearinghouse for the Future. Her task was to profile members of Congress who would be susceptible to astrology and New Age mumbo-jumbo. At one stage, she had in excess of 100 congressmen in her classes. Daily sessions were held in which a variety of astrological forecasts were made based on her occult perceptions. Besides congressmen, other prominent people who attended her sessions were Michael Walsh, Thornton Bradshaw, a leading member of the Committee of 300, and David Sternlight, a senior vice president of Allstate Insurance Company. Some of the more important members of the Committee of 300 are also members of NATO, a fact which we ought to remember. These Committee of 300 members often hold several offices. Among the NATO Club of Rome membership are found Harlan Cleveland, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Joseph Slater, a director of the Aspen Institute, Donald Lesh, a former staffer in the U.S. National Security Agency, George McGee and Claiborne Pell, to name a few examples. It is important that we remember these names, make a list of them if you wish, so as to recall who they are and what they stand for when their names come up in television programs and news services. Following intelligence modus vivendi, leaders of the committee often appear on television, usually in the most innocent of guises. We ought to be aware that nothing they do is innocent. The Committee of 300 has planted its agents in the muscle and sinew of the United States, in its government, in Congress, in advisory posts around the President, as ambassadors and as secretaries of state. From time to time, the Club of Rome holds gatherings and conferences which, although they appear under innocuous titles, break up into action committees, each of which is assigned a specific task and a specific target date by which time their assignments must be completed. If it does nothing else, the Committee of 300 is working to a very specific timetable. The first Club of Rome conference in the United States was called by the Committee of 300 in 1969 under the title, The Association of the Club of Rome. The next meeting was held in 1970 under the title Riverdale Center of Religious Research and was directed by Thomas Burney. Texas, starting in 1971 thereafter, regular conferences have been held at Woodlands every year. Also in 1971, at a later date, the Mitchell Energy and Development Corporation held its Energy Strategy meeting for the Club of Rome. The recurring theme, limit the growth of the USA. Then, to crown it all, the first global conference on the future was held in July of 1980, attended by 4,000 social engineers and members of think tanks, all of whom were members of or affiliated with various institutions operating under Club of Rome umbrella organizations. The first global conference on the future had the blessing of the White House, which held its own conference based on the transcripts of the first Global Conference Forum. It was called the White House Commission on the 1980s, and officially recommended the policies of the Club of Rome as a guide to future U.S. policies, and even went so far as to say that the United States economy is moving out of the industrial phase. This echoed the theme of Sir Peter Vickers Hall and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and provides further proof of the control exercised by the Committee of 300 over U.S. affairs, both domestic and foreign. As I said in 1981, we are set up, politically, socially, and economically so that we remain locked into the Club of Rome's plans. Everything is rigged against us. If we are to survive, then we must break the stranglehold the Committee of 300 has on our government. In every election since Calvin Coolidge ran for the White House, the Committee of 300 has been able to plant its agents in key positions in government so that it matters not who gets the White House post. For example, every one of the candidates who ran for the presidency from the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt were selected, some like to call it hand-picked, by the Council on Foreign Relations acting on the instructions of the RIIA. Especially in the 1980 election, every candidate for the highest office in the United States was run by the CFR. Therefore, it was of no consequence to the conspirators who won the presidential race. Through such Trojan horses as the Heritage Foundation and the CFR, all key policy-making positions in the new administrations were filled by the Council on Foreign Relations nominees, and before that, since the 1960s, by NATO Club of Rome yes-men, thereby ensuring that key policy decisions bore the indelible stamp of the Club of Rome and the CFR, acting as the executive arms of the Committee of 300. Both the 1984 and 1988 elections followed this long-established pattern. Secretary of State George Shultz was the perfect choice of the Committee of 300 for the office of Secretary of State. Shultz was always a creature of Henry Kissinger, the ruling order-giver for the CFR. Moreover, his position with Bechtel, a key Committee of 300 company of global dimensions, gave him access to countries that might otherwise have been suspicious of his Kissinger connection. The Carter administration accelerated the process of key pro-conspiracy personnel in key positions. Before Carter was elected, his key campaign strategist, Hamilton Jordan, said that if Cyrus Vance or Brzezinski received appointments in the Carter cabinet, he, Jordan, would resign. They did. Jordan did not resign. Carter's choice of Paul Volcker, in fact he was told to appoint Volcker by David Rockefeller, started the collapse of the U.S. economy according to the plan laid down by the Club of Rome. We are up against powerful forces who are dedicated to the goal of a one-world government. We have been engaged in a devastatingly crippling war for the past 45 years, only it is not perceived as such. We are brainwashed, methodically and systematically, without ever being aware of it. The Tavistock Institute provided the system for this to take place, and then set its operations in motion. The only way we can fight back is by exposing the conspirators and their multiplicity of front organizations. We need men with experience who can formulate strategy to defend our priceless heritage which, once lost, will never again reappear. We need to learn the methods the conspirators use, learn them and adopt countermeasures. Only a crash program will stop the rot which is consuming our nation. Some may have difficulty in accepting the idea of a global conspiracy because so many writers have made financial gain from it. Others doubt that activity on a global scale can be successfully advanced. They see the huge bureaucracy of our government and then say, well, how are we supposed to believe that private people can do more than the government does? This overlooks the fact that government is part of the conspiracy. Hard evidence is what they want and hard evidence is difficult to come by. Others say, so what? What do I care about a conspiracy? I don't even bother to vote. That is exactly the way the general population of America was profiled to react. Our people have become discouraged and confused, the results of 45 years of warfare conducted against us. How this is done is explained in Bernard Lewin's book, but how many people would bother to read an academic's nonfiction book? We are reacting exactly as we were profiled to act. Demoralized and confused people will be far more ready to welcome the sudden appearance of a great man who promises to solve every problem and guarantee a well-ordered society in which people are fully employed and domestic strife is minimal. Their dictator, for that is who it will be welcomed with open arms. Knowing who the enemy is a vital necessity. No one can fight against an unidentified enemy. This book could be used as a military field manual. Study its content and memorize all names. I have mentioned profiling techniques quite frequently in this chapter. A full explanation of profiling is contained in the next chapter. One of the most profound pieces of information to come out of the science of profiling is the relative ease in which this can be accomplished in individuals, party groups, political entities, and so on right on down the line. Once we wake up as to how easy this is to do, the conspiracy will no longer be more than we can comprehend. The assassination of President Kennedy and the attempt on the life of President Reagan become easy to understand.